Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed examining the snowfall package and then discussing some of the pros and cons of the approach the New York Times took on that piece. If you recall, in part one, we spent a good deal of time talking about our definition of multimedia reporting and multimedia storytelling. And we covered many of the aspects that was in that definition. We talked about that we're primarily talking about a journalism and documentary context or tradition. That includes many different kinds of media and that each medium needs to complement the other. We talked about delivery, we're talking either web or tablet applications for these types of stories. We didn't talk a lot about structure, so that's going to be our focus in part two of this lesson. We're going to talk about that, yes, these stories are to some degree nonlinear, but they vary in the amount that they are not linear. Some are more nonlinear than others, and some are more immersive than others. So we're going to examine a few of these storytelling sites and try to put into context how they're structuring these pieces. We're going to talk about three structures for multimedia storytelling that's been suggested by others. One is interestingly called the Christmas tree. We'll talk about why it's called that for a minute. It's one that's been around for a while and it's kind of starting to lose favor a bit. We'll talk about embedded multimedia that you've already seen examples of in this class, and then we'll talk about the nonlinear multimedia narrative. So you sort of can think of this a little bit as maybe more nonlinear as we move forward through these. So Christmas tree, what is that talking about? Well, let's give credit where credit is due. Regina McCombs, formerly of the Poynter Institute and now with Minnesota Public Radio doing interactive stories for them, likened the Christmas tree to hanging ornaments. So the text was still the main thing that you're supposed to focus on, but over here to the side were these little ornaments of multimedia. So I'll show you a couple examples of what that looks like. Makes sense in the context of this site. This is Lawrence Journal World's website covering a University of Kansas basketball game. The game story is the main thing we're supposed to focus on, but you notice over on the side we have a photo slideshow, we have audio of the coach and certain players from the press conference. So, good information, but not essential in understanding the flow of the main story. So again, kind of ornamental way of thinking about how multimedia can be used. Again, this used to be sort of the dominant model. We're seeing less of it. However, you still can see it in more long-form stories. The second piece we're going to look at is this ProPublica report on a hedge fund's role in fostering the financial crisis in 2007 and 2008. And as the example before, there is a traditional print story on the right, but on the left side we have some multimedia graphics. So we have a chart explaining how some of these deals were constructed. And then we have an interactive timeline of some of these deals that the hedge fund made. So bubble charts show the proportion over time of some of these deals in relation to all similar deals at this particular time. And then you can link further. You can go to a detailed chart and even in some cases prospectus of some of these really very risky financial transactions that helped foster the financial crash that we had. So again, longer form story, but sometimes the Christmas tree approach still works in giving added context to a story. The second structure we'll talk about is embedded multimedia. And the example that we talked about in the discussion board last time, the snowfall piece, would be an example of embedded multimedia, meaning that yes, the text is still the primary driving force of the story arc, but multimedia is placed in certain parts where it's appropriate for that story flow. So for example, in Snowfall, as you went through, you saw there were embedded video interviews with individuals who are being quoted in the story. Those video interviews gave more background and context. Some stunning motion graphics, including an aerial detail of the area of the Cascades in Washington State where the story took place. Snowfall also demonstrated groundbreaking synchronization between text and graphics. For example, when you were reading about each person starting to make the descent down the mountain in the ill-fated ski trip, an adjoining graphic traces his or her own route down the mountain. And a real-time graphic simulation of the avalanche gives a chilling perspective on the horrific scope of the tragedy. Another embedded multimedia narrative that has garnered almost as much as attention as Snowfall was the NSA Files package from The Guardian. The British publication was one of the prime outlets receiving leaked documents from Edward Snowden exposing the massive surveillance program run by the National Security Agency. The Guardian story begins with a Mission Impossible-like opening, almost like a movie trailer, teasing you with a few provocative opinions about the NSA program. The real surprise comes after you begin reading the text. After the lead, you're set up for a quote from a congresswoman who is wary of the NSA's increased power. But instead of you reading a quote from her, the synchronization automatically starts playing a video clip of her. You actually see and hear her discuss her reservations. Her inflections, her facial expressions, are something no typed quote can capture. Of course, what made the NSA story possible was the release of documents by Edward Snowden, and the Guardian's treatment makes it possible to read the most relevant documents embedded at the most appropriate time in the narrative. The Guardian also embeds explainer graphics on related issues, such as the different types of encryption and why a combination of protocols might offer you the most privacy. The third structure we'll discuss is the nonlinear multimedia narrative. As the name suggests, these stories do not have a specific beginning, middle, and end. We'll look at two such examples, each having a very different approach. First, let's look at Crisis Guide Iran. It's a collaboration between the Council on Foreign Relations and MediaStorm, the multimedia storytelling studio headed by Brian Storm, who shared his thoughts on collaboration in Part 1. This is an example of a story where media decisions were made based on the type of information being conveyed. For example, an 8-minute video incorporating photos, sound, and interviews with experts was appropriate for an overview of the crisis. For historical background, an interactive timeline allows users to trace the country from its Persian roots to the modern day. Interactive maps orient us to Iran's neighbors and allow us to compare them on economic, demographic, and military bases. Another map locates Iran's nuclear sites and details what the purported purposes are. And videos with experts allow us to thoughtfully consider the various options to contain or confront Iran. With this topical organization, producers of the Crisis Guide are able to target which media work best for which purpose. Also a nonlinear multimedia narrative, with a very different feel, is Hollow, an interactive documentary chronicling the decline of one West Virginia county, a symbol of similar decline in other rural areas across the country. The vision of documentarian Elaine Sheldon, the project was funded through crowdsourcing on Kickstarter. It is an immersive experience. The opening shows us historical photos of the county while simultaneously chronicling its rapid decline since the 1960s. Once inside the project, the viewer is immersed with sights and sounds from the county. Housed within are short video documentaries of approximately 30 county residents who are trying to turn around its fortunes. The project is highly participatory, both by stories submitted by residents and also through user responses, including their own experiences leaving their home areas or staying where they are. These are but a few of the many notable, innovative storytelling projects being released virtually every day. Let's continue our exploration of how structure underpins these types of projects over on the discussion board. See you there.